And joining us now in studio, Marci McDonald, author of The Armageddon Factor, The Rise of Christian Nationalism in Canada. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Pleased to meet you. Now, why don't we just start by having you sort of state the case, the premise behind the book about the religious right and its influence in politics today. Go ahead.
State the case always makes it sound as if I have written some polemic, that I am defending some position that I'm laying out with great controversy in my wake.
Well, you do have a view on this, Marci.
Well, actually, I have less of a view than a reporter's job that I've done. Okay. It's the first book that's been written on what I saw was a growing phenomenon in Canada. No one else was writing about it. I first wrote about it for the Walrus magazine in 2006. And 4 years later, it's now grown into a book, and much has happened in that time. But it had struck me when I moved back to Canada from the United States, many years in Washington, both as Maclean's bureau chief and later for U.S. Magazine, that I was suddenly hearing during the same-sex marriage debate here, the sort of rhetoric that I thought I'd left behind in Washington over religious and social values issues. Most people in the mainstream media, it seemed to me, just assumed those voices had disappeared when the legislation went through and the Christian right leaders who were most outspoken apparently disappeared from the scene. In fact, as I discovered, they dug in, they had laid down organizational roots, quite sophisticated organizational roots in Ottawa.
Well, they recalibrated, waiting for another day.
And they were determined that they would not have the same kind of defeat ever again, and it didn't matter who was in power.
But tell us, what do you think the aim of the kind of, as you put it, the organized political Christian right is in this country?
Well, the overall aim is to have a greater say in politics, and there may be nothing wrong with that. Small slivers of it have a much more focused agenda, and they believe that Canada should be once more a Christian nation. And that might strike a lot of people of other faiths as a not too desirable outcome.
Now, you just said it's a small sliver of the overall Christian picture.
It is.
Is it a big enough sliver to be worried about?
Well, those are the people that I call Christian nationalists. What's amazing about it is that when I heard some of their views and attended some of their conferences, I really thought it was a fringe group. I mean, we're not talking here of the Evangelical Fellowship or the broad organizations that represent conservative Christians largely, or conservative members of other faiths. What we're talking about is a very active, very organized sliver which has access to the government, has passes to Parliament Hill, is invited to VIP receptions after the throne and budget speeches, has letters of support from Stephen Harper, and we know those are not easy to come by.
No, but do they mean anything?
Well, that kind of access is very unusual. There are NGOs all over Ottawa who would kill for it. One of the things people keep asking me is, well, what do they have to show for this? Well, these are early days. Was one of the members of, one of the organizers of this movement or phenomenon said to me, we're 30 years behind the States. So I'm pointing out a burgeoning development. But 30 years later, those evangelicals who watched and hoped that George Bush would give them more than coded rhetoric were complaining that they weren't getting anything from him. Now, from the outside, from the Canadian side of the border, he had given them lots, and including abortion legislation and for overseas funding.
But let me pick up on that. Let's talk about abortion legislation more specifically. This Prime Minister, whom some people believe to be an evangelical Christian.
He has said he's an evangelical.
He has said so, but some people would look at his record and say, if that's the case, he certainly hasn't infused it into his public policy, because he's been pretty clear about not wanting an abortion bill to come forward, right?
Well, he's a very smart politician, and he's, I think no one would detract from the strategic talents of Stephen Harper, least of all me, who has been the object of some of them most recently. But he said from the first, I will not be bringing forward an abortion bill. When he announced, two things have happened. There's been a rise of these political groups or these faith-based groups who have put down organizational roots to lobby the government. I'm not talking about general people of faith wanting a voice, a vote. I'm talking about organized lobbying of the government. That has coincided with a prime minister who in 2003 set out an agenda for what was then the Canadian Alliance Party to reach out to social and religious conservatives as an electoral party building strategy. And that he has done. And he said at the time, this is incremental. Have patience. Do not expect any big dramatic moves. And that's exactly what he's done. But in 2008, when the economic meltdown happened, things changed for Stephen Harper. He found his natural constituency, economic conservatives, very, very critical. And suddenly, his overtures to economic and religious conservatives have become far more blatant. I put my book to bed, and honestly, in the last couple of months, I wish I could have rushed in and stopped those presses and inserted more of the daily headlines.
But you know, I did read your book, and it seemed to me that every time the religious right got close to having some kind of policy victory in this country, Stephen Harper would come in and undercut it.
That's right.
So it sounds to me like the thing you are, I don't know if decrying is too strong a word, but
it
the
is
thing,
too strong a word.
Okay, the thing you are putting inverted commas around, telling us to watch out for, hasn't really got that far forward, because the Prime Minister, who's supposed to be an evangelical Christian, has put the brakes on at the key moment.
He wants a majority, and he knows, unlike in the United States, you can't get a majority, or you can't call the evangelicals or conservative Christians really in this country, because our religious right is much different than that in the United States. There are far more Catholics in this country. He can't get a majority. He can't call those people his base the way George Bush could. It's just a numbers game. So he must walk this uneasy tightrope that I don't think, as what I'd call a cerebral Christian, I don't think as a cerebral Christian he really wants to go in some flaming religious direction.
Who's the cerebral Christian, him or you?
He is.
He is, okay.
I think that's what he's been called. And I think that he's more comfortable with economic conservative policies. He realized when he took over the Alliance that he needed all of these social and religious conservatives, and he was, until relatively recently, throwing them tidbits. SOPs, they called it, and they were not happy with them. And they said, we'll stay home in the 2008 election. It's not clear whether or not they did, because so many people stayed home.
But you seem to be suggesting that the second he gets his majority government, in comes this right-wing social conservative movement, which will be perfectly at home with this government and, you know, sort of march us on the road to a theocracy. Is that what you're saying?
No, that isn't actually what I'm saying, because I think that's not his nature. Now, a successor to him who is more committed to this movement, a successor such as Stockwell Day, might have a different agenda. I think Tom Flanagan, who often speaks for Stephen Harper,
Not anymore. He gives him advice through the media, but I don't think he...
Well, trial balloons
Okay.
too. I think that he has said Harper would naturally govern from the center, or the right of center, as he would say. But we have seen more recently in all these defunding moves, defunding the Eco Justice Group, Kairos, defunding women's groups, and the G8 initiative, much more overt initiatives to this particular constituency, and it comes in the wake of the tremendous criticism he's received from economic conservatives.
So here's the question. So what? What's wrong with that?
And perhaps nothing at all. And if you've read my book, you know I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I listened for 4 years.
Okay, you keep talking. I'm going to find the passage.
I listened for 4 years to conservative Christians telling me they could not get covered by the mainstream media. They did not have their voices represented in politics. I think there's a point at which voices of faith and people of faith should be represented in the political process. I mean, there's a history of it. Tommy Douglas, all sorts of people. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. I think when you use religion and social values issues as a party building strategy, as a wedge issue to divide one kind of Christian against another, against faith against one another, you have opened a Pandora's box, and you're headed in the direction of the Tea Party movement.
But here we are on page 353. Just so you know, I got past the introduction, okay? For those hardcore believers who expected Stephen Harper to roll back same-sex marriage and enshrine fetal rights, he has been a major disappointment. Even the Evangelical Fellowship has noted the, quote, lack of policy gains on his watch. And I could go on. I mean, it sounds like the thing, and I know you say you don't have a view on this, but I mean, and okay, maybe you didn't write
I'm not saying I don't have a view. I'm saying that I'm not representing some crusade against people of faith having a voice in politics. And I think what we're seeing is, when I wrote that, he had not made as many moves as he has in the months since.
Okay, but he's the most, I think it's probably fair to say, is he's the most evangelical prime minister we've ever had, and he's a huge disappointment to the evangelical movement. And if that's the case, do people who don't want this country moving closer to a kind of a socially conservative agenda in their public life, do they really have that much to worry about?
I don't know whether they do. That's up to them to decide, but it's important that somebody write about this, I think, connect the dots. It isn't just in government policy. Tremendous changes are being made in the organization of the public service, in the organization of the courts, the choosing of judges. There are a lot of fundamental directional changes that never appear in a bill before Parliament, never get debated. And those few moves that he's made, such as the film tax credit funding bill that was slipped into a taxation housekeeping bill, and obviously you cannot call that open. It was covered. It got all the way to the Senate before a watchful lawyer discovered it. I mean, if the mainstream media is either not covering it or not equipped to cover it, because I can't imagine an overtaxed bureau chief in Ottawa assigning some reporter on a Saturday to a Christian conference where there happened to be all these MPs and claims made. Yeah. I just happen to have the luxury of time. I connected the dots. People can do with it what they may.
Okay. Let me take a couple of minutes here and go through some of the criticism of the book, because listen, we should all write a book that gets this much talk about, right? Because they've been quoting you all over the papers, and you've had a great buzz for the book, and
the Conservative Party send out memos.
Yeah, I mean, you've gotten great publicity from it. However, it's impossible to write a perfect book, and you have had your share of critics who've gone through the text and who have found, you can tell me whether you think there's significant errors, but errors in the book. Now, I know, as I've written books, and it's hard to write a perfect book, but do the errors take away from the message?
Well, in fact, I mean, you're mainly talking about an Ezra Levant piece that...
I'm not actually. I'm talking about my own read of it.
Oh, because the errors that Ezra Levant picked out, there were two that are errors and that will be corrected. No author wants. But there was one in which he had to go all the way to the source notes to find an error, because in the text, there was no error.
Okay, well, I'm just...
A reference to Rob Anders.
Again, here's page 221. I'm just going through it here, and you talk about, ever since former Premier William Davis extended the same public funding to Catholic high schools that their elementary counterparts had won a confederation, well, Davis didn't do it. I mean, it was the Liberals who came in and do it. He tried to do it, but he didn't do it. And you go on to say, his former education minister, Bernard Shapiro, was doing a task force. Bernard Shapiro was the deputy minister of education. He wasn't the education minister. Very next paragraph here, you talk about Mike, and Chris Stockwell's on the show. He was around when this happened. No politician dared touch the question of wooing the suburban evangelical vote. Mike Harris promised tax credits for private school, but his proposal never made it into law, and the issue appeared to drop off the political map. Well, they did it. They passed the what was it called? The Equity in Education Tax Credit, where they gave you a tax break for sending your kids to private schools or religious schools.
But it wasn't the way they first promised it. It was a much reduced form of it.
Well, it wasn't full funding for private schools, but it was, bottom line is, of course, people who don't like what you are reporting on will seize on anything to say, she doesn't know what she's talking about, look at all these mistakes. Is that a concern for you?
Well, it's always a concern as a reporter, because it's a job of reporting. But in fact, it doesn't change the general connecting of the dots, the general landscape that I'm laying out. It is the first attempt to do so, and I had very little cooperation from some of the players. So if people won't answer my questions, now...
Can I tell you something? I have sympathy for that, because we invited, I think, about 10 or 11 Tory MPs of faith to come on the program tonight to discuss this. And not a one, our producer Mark Brosen's been after them for a couple of weeks, not a one would come on.
I heard that.
Except for one who, just I think late last night, Mike Lake from Alberta said he would come on, but by then we had the lovely Mr. Stockwell agreeing, so we didn't need anybody. But no, you're right, they don't want to talk about it.
That's their business.
No.
Certainly, it's an interesting tack because the finding errors is the second wave of criticism. The first wave was just plain name calling. And that was very interesting to me because I had warned that if we opened up this debate, these wedge issues, this is the kind of polarized, venomous, vitriolic, ad hominem attacks that we could be open to 30 years down the road here, the way we're seeing them in the United States. Lo and behold, I found myself the subject of them within a week, called a bigot, a freak, an anti-Semite. Reasonable people of goodwill can differ on policy in the Middle East, and it's quite an acceptable debate within Israel. I found it totally shocking that people were proving me right.
As far as I know, we are all reasonable people of goodwill on this program tonight, and we will discuss these issues. So Marci, if you would, thank you for getting us kick-started tonight, and cross the studio, if you will, with me, and we'll continue the debate on the other side.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.